They say you don't really know who you can count on until you're too weak to stand. I was about to find out. The ceiling tiles above me hadn't changed in the 2 nights I'd spent in this hospital bed, but they looked different now, sharper somehow, as if waiting for something. I shifted slightly, careful not to wake the babies, and tried not to flinch as pain pulled at my side. The twins were asleep in the portable crib by the window, Noah curled in a ball around his bunny, Maisie's hand resting softly on his back, like she already knew he needed her more. From outside, faint music drifted up through the spring air, banjos, fiddles, the unmistakable pulse of live drums. The Spring Mountain Revival Festival had taken over downtown Asheville for the weekend, and even up here on the third floor of St. Helena's, I could feel the heartbeat of a party I wasn't invited to. It had been my mother's excuse. You know how long we've waited for these tickets. Her voice still rang in my ears from that last video call. It's not like your surgery's life-threatening. They'll take good care of you. Don't guilt us, Clara. I hadn't said anything, just nodded, lips pressed tight, and watched as she adjusted her scarf and turned the phone toward my father, who raised his hand in something between a wave and a dismissal. Then the call ended, the silence in my room louder than the machines beeping beside me. I checked my phone again. No new messages, no missed calls. I swiped away the home screen and opened the list I'd scribbled hours earlier. Kayla, out of state. Hannah, newborn twins of her own. Rosa, her oldest graduating this weekend. My neighbor from 2 blocks over. Her mother had fallen, broken a hip. Each name had been a hope. Each one had said no. Nurse Harriet came in quietly, her sneakers soft on the tile. Her hair, the color of early snow, peeked out from under a floral scrub cap. She carried a cup of something warm that smelled faintly like peppermint and chamomile. "Still no word?" she asked gently, setting the cup down beside me. I shook my head. "They're at the festival." She didn't say anything, just stood beside the crib for a moment, watching the babies with that soft expression older women reserve for things too small to defend themselves. "I know someone," she said finally, eyes still on the twins. "Deborah Shaw. She used to work in trauma pediatrics. Quiet type, knows her way around babies in a storm." I was tense. "A stranger?" "She's not a stranger to the right people," Harriet replied. "And she never says yes unless she means it." I turned my face to the window. The music outside had shifted, livelier now. Some fiddle-heavy track people would be spinning their partners to under strings of colored lights. I imagined my parents laughing beneath lanterns, sipping something spiked out of paper cups. My chest tightened. I don't trust easily. Harriet pulled the chair closer and sat. "You don't have to trust her forever, just long enough." Maisie stirred in the crib, whimpering. I started to rise, but Harriet beat me to it, tucking the blanket gently under her chin. "She's good," she said, "and she'll come if I ask." My hand hovered over my phone. I stared at the screen, at the list, at the digital void where something from my parents should have been. Then, without quite meaning to, I opened my banking app, scrolled to the standing transfers, and canceled the one labeled M&D, monthly. It was scheduled for tomorrow. Not anymore. "I'll try," I whispered. "You can call her." Harriet didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "I'll be right back." She left with a rustle of fabric and a faint scent of lavender trailing behind. I leaned back slowly, wincing as I shifted. Through the window, I could make out tiny strings of bulbs wrapped around the trees lining Main Street. A man in a straw hat walked by, holding a corn dog in one hand and his daughter's hand in the other. The crib squeaked. Noah kicked in his sleep, making a small, breathy sound. I reached over and smoothed his hair. Ethan would have known what to do. He'd always known what to say when things fell apart, how to carry calm like it was stitched into his bones. I closed my eyes for a moment, wishing I could hear his voice. All I heard was the soft creak of the hallway door opening. A silhouette paused at the threshold. She didn't say much, but the air in the room shifted when she stepped inside. She didn't have a clipboard or a badge, just a calm voice and a picture book with frayed corners. At first, I wasn't sure she'd really said anything. She just stood near the door, taking in the room, the twins, me. Her eyes were steady but kind, the kind you didn't look away from out of fear or habit, but because they saw more than you were ready to admit. She stepped forward quietly, her shoes making almost no sound. Her cardigan was patched at the elbows, the cuffs loose, the color faded from what once might have been navy. She had a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, soft with use, like it had lived a few decades more than either of us had planned. Deborah didn't introduce herself with a handshake. She crouched beside the crib, whispering something too low for me to catch. Maisie opened one eye, blinked once, then let it close again. Noah squirmed, his thumb finding his mouth, and he let out a soft, tired sound. Deborah reached into her bag and pulled out a children's book with tape on the spine and crayon scribbles across the back cover. She opened it on the floor in front of her, crossing her legs like she'd done it 1,000 times in 1,000 different homes. Her voice was low and even, reading about a small bear who couldn't sleep without his nightlight. The room softened. I blinked hard, the post-op meds making my head feel slow and my breath a little too shallow. "You're Deborah," I said after a while. She nodded, still turning the page. "I am. You came for them." "I came because Harriet called." She looked up. "And because I could." There was no judgment in her tone, no pity either. Just a quiet truth, like saying it was raining or that babies cried. Her presence settled into the room the way a blanket settles over tired legs. Useful, not ornamental. I watched as she read. Maisie stirred and stretched, her foot resting against Deborah's thigh. Noah's bunny had slipped behind his back, and Deborah adjusted it without stopping the story. She didn't glance at me. She wasn't performing. "I don't have a lot to give you," I said. "My husband's gone. There's still medical debt. I was covering my parents' mortgage until this week." Deborah's eyes lifted, not in surprise or accusation, just acknowledgement. "I'm not here for that." "Then what are you here for?" She turned the last page of the book and closed it gently. "The kids and you. That's all." That was when I felt it. A knot I hadn't known was there, loosening somewhere between my ribs. I looked at the ceiling. My eyes burned, but no tears came. Not yet. My voice wobbled, but I asked anyway. "If something happens in surgery, sir, would you stay with them?" Deborah didn't pause. "Of course." I blinked. "Just like that?" She nodded once. "Yes." I don't remember reaching for the tablet, but it was in my hands. I tapped the emergency contact form Harriet had left on the screen and typed in her name. "You're the only name on this now," I said, handing it over. Deborah took it without hesitation, folded it in half, and slipped it into the inside pocket of her cardigan. Then she stood, stretched her back with a quiet breath, and walked to the window. She pulled the curtain back slightly to look outside. "The rain stopped," she said. I closed my eyes. I hadn't even noticed. The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I opened my phone one more time. No new messages. Still nothing from my parents. I scrolled to my saved contacts and found their thread. It sat beneath a dozen others: doctors, babysitters, grocery lists. I typed quickly, "I'm choosing my kids this time, not you." I hit send. I didn't sign it. I didn't have to. Maisie whimpered again, and Deborah crossed to the crib, placing a hand gently on the side without saying a word. Noah kicked once, then sighed, the kind of sound that made you believe some small corner of the world was still okay. I turned my head toward her. She was humming now, some old lullaby that reminded me of front porches and summer fans and the smell of clean laundry. "If something happens," I repeated softly. Deborah glanced over her shoulder. "You already asked. My answer is still yes." I nodded once, the edge of the pillow cool against my cheek. My body ached, but it was a dull ache, one I could fold around for now. Deborah tucked the book back into her bag and resumed her seat on the floor, one hand resting lightly on the side of the crib. She didn't say another word, and I didn't ask for more. Deborah tucks the paper into her cardigan pocket, then hums an old lullaby. I felt sleepy. I woke to the smell of warm linen, faint jasmine, and the sound of someone else holding my life together. The light had changed, brighter now, not hospital fluorescence, but morning sun sneaking in through the blinds. It striped across the blanket covering me, a soft lavender and cream weave that hadn't been there the night before. I touched the yarn with the tips of my fingers. It was hand-stitched, that much I could tell. The kind of thing someone makes for someone they don't owe anything to. Across the room, Deborah sat in the armchair, one leg tucked beneath her, a paperback balanced on the armrest. Maisie was nestled against her chest, one tiny hand tangled in Deborah's cardigan buttons. Noah sat on her knee, babbling softly at something only he understood. They looked peaceful. I blinked, my throat was dry, my abdomen ached. But it wasn't the sharp twist from before, more like a dull, deep throb that let me know I was still here. Deborah looked up, closing the book with one hand. "You're awake?" I nodded, lips too dry to speak. She leaned forward and reached for the water cup Nurse Harriet must have left on the tray. I drank slowly, letting the chill settle behind my teeth. "You've been in and out since yesterday afternoon," she said. "They said the surgery went well. Clean, no complications." I exhaled, the air rattling in my chest a little. "Thank God." She didn't answer, just glanced down at Maisie, who was now drooling onto her sweater. "They okay?" I asked. "They're fine," she said. "Hungry and loud in turns, but they like the window. Noah thinks the pigeons are robots." I managed a soft laugh, then winced. Note to self, laughing hurts. "Noted," Deborah replied. I reached again for the blanket and found a small card tucked under the corner. "For your girls, D simple, no flourish." Just 4 words in small slanted handwriting. I sat with that for a moment, the kind of gesture you don't know how to thank properly because there's no invoice attached. Then I picked up my phone. The lock screen was littered with red dots, calls, texts, voicemails. I swiped and counted. 17 missed calls. 13 from my father, 4 from my mother. I didn't open them. I went straight to voicemail. The first message played loud and fast. My father's voice clipped. "We just got a notice from the bank. You can't just pull your support like that, Clara. That mortgage is still active." Click, the next one was angrier. After that, my mother's voice, coated in sugar but lined with barbs. "Sweetheart, we're worried, but you've really put us in a difficult position. We weren't expecting this." None of them mentioned the surgery. Not once did they ask if I was alive, or if their grandchildren had eaten or cried. I deleted them all. "You didn't have to do all this," I said aloud, eyes still on the screen. Deborah didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Someone once did it for me," she said. I looked up. "Years ago," she continued, "when I was younger, much younger." "Who?" She didn't speak right away. Her fingers smoothed Maisie's hair back gently, as if deciding how much to say. Then she looked over at the nightstand, the photo frame, the one with Ethan holding both twins, one in each arm, grinning like a man who had no idea how short time would be. "I didn't know him well," she said, "but he helped me." I felt my breath hitch. "My husband?" Deborah nodded. "Years ago, I didn't even know his name then." "Not really. He built something for me, a digital portfolio. I was in foster care, about to age out, and he volunteered with a nonprofit that helped girls like me get into community college." I couldn't speak. I just listened. "He took a photo I didn't know someone had taken of me reading to a little girl. He made it the homepage, added a quote underneath it. Something about resilience. I didn't even write it, but it made me feel like I mattered." She adjusted to Maisie again. "He didn't have to do that, but he did." I swallowed hard. My fingers clenched the edge of the blanket. "He never told me." "He wouldn't have," she said softly. "He didn't do it to be known, but I do remember." Before I could answer, Nurse Harriet walks in. "Ready to go home, sweetheart?" Deborah picked up the photo of Ethan with a look that told me she'd been holding a secret far longer than I'd been holding grief. I didn't ask right away. I just watched as her thumb brushed across the corner of the frame, slow and careful like she was touching something fragile, not the glass, but maybe the memory behind it. The room was quiet except for the twins babbling near the playmat Harriet had rolled in from storage. They were surrounded by soft toys, plastic stacking rings, and a worn stuffed bunny with one ear flopped the wrong way. "I didn't recognize him at first," Deborah said. "Not when I got the call from Harriet, not when I stepped into this room. But later, when I saw this." She turned the photo toward me, and I saw Ethan's smile again, the easy one, the one he wore when he was holding both babies, like his arms were made to carry more than weight. My breath caught. What happened? I asked, even though a part of me already knew. Deborah sat on the window ledge. Outside, the remnants of the spring festival were still clinging to the streets below, balloons tied to lampposts. A stray program fluttering down the sidewalk. The stage had been disassembled, but the energy hadn't quite left the air. I was 17, she began. Last group home before I aged out. Angry, invisible. You've heard the story 1,000 times. I wasn't planning on making it far, but there was a counselor at the shelter who nominated me for a scholarship. Problem was, I needed a portfolio, something that made me look like more than a statistic. I listened. I didn't breathe too loud. They reached out to this local nonprofit that partnered with freelancers, people who donated time to kids like me. And one day I got an email with a link, my name, my face, a quote about how books change lives. I still don't know where they found that photo or that quote, but it was all beautiful. She looked down. That site got me into a community college, then a certification program, and I've been working with kids ever since. I touched the blanket across my lap, the lavender one she'd brought. You never told me. I didn't know it was him, she said. Not until I saw the photo on your nightstand. He looked older than I remembered, but I never forgot that smile. My throat tightened. He never said anything. He didn't even mention the nonprofit. He wouldn't have, she said again, and this time there was something almost protective in her voice. He didn't do it for thanks. He did it because it was the right thing. I looked at the twins. Maisie was shaking a rattle, Noah chewing on the ear of his bunny. They were too young to understand the legacy, but I wasn't. I didn't even know I was helping someone, I said. I mean, through him. It never crossed my mind that someone might circle back. Deborah's smile was soft. I think that's how real kindness works. It loops when it needs to. We sat there in the hush of mid-morning, the light stretching across the floor like fingers that didn't want to let go. Harriet came in briefly, checked a chart, winked at Deborah, and wheeled away with a nod. Do you ever wonder, I asked quietly, if the things we do without thinking end up being the ones that last? All the time, she said. I wonder if maybe the small things are the only ones that do. The twins giggled at something on the mat, some private joke only babies understood. I wanted to cry again, but not from pain this time. It was something closer to awe. I shifted slowly, one hand pressed against my side. Why did you say yes, to Harriet, I mean? You didn't know who I was. I didn't need to, she replied, but I knew I could help, so I did. I thought about all the reasons I'd given people money, guilt, obligation, habit, but never because I just wanted them to feel safe. Then maybe you were always meant to be here. Deborah met my gaze. Her eyes didn't waver. I believe in circles closing. There's something strange about getting 17 calls and not one of them asking if you made it out alive. By the time Deborah helped carry the twins back into my apartment, the sky had shifted from soft spring blue to that pale overcast gray that makes afternoon feel like early evening. The floor creaked underfoot, familiar and forgiving, the kind of sound that reminded me I wasn't in a hospital bed anymore, even if my body still moved like it had left a part of itself behind on those sheets. She laid Maisie down on the living room rug, then gently coaxed Noah from his car seat, where he promptly flopped beside his sister like they'd rehearsed it. I leaned against the kitchen counter, one hand resting on the surface to steady myself. The cabinet still smelled faintly of lemon oil. The silence of home was oddly intimate, different from hospital quiet, which always felt borrowed. I opened my phone and scrolled. The group email thread had grown teeth overnight. Subject line, unbelievable. My father had forwarded his mortgage panic to cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. My mother had replied with what she probably thought were tempered words, but every sentence dripped with the same message. Clara abandoned us. Clara ruined our plans. Clara was supposed to take care of us. They didn't mention my surgery, not once. I glanced at Deborah, who had knelt to pick up a stray pacifier. I used to think silence was the worst thing, I said. She looked up. But I think this is worse. being talked about like a budget cut. Deborah didn't answer, just returned the pacifier to the diaper bag, calm as ever. Did you ever go back? I asked. To the people who let you down? No, she said. I just built something better around me. There was a knock at the door. I didn't move. Deborah stepped over and opened it just enough to see. Leanne. She stood in the doorway holding a cloth grocery bag and a nervous smile. Her coat looked too stiff for her frame, like it still belonged to a version of her that had opinions on handbags and real estate listings. I brought a sweet potato casserole, she said. I blinked. You're here. She nodded, then stepped inside, placing the dish gently on the counter. They told me it was just a checkup. I didn't reply. Leanne fidgeted with the scarf knotted around her neck. I should have asked. I should have checked. I pulled down 2 mugs and filled one with tea, the other with silence. They said you were being dramatic, she continued, voice lower now. I believed them. I handed her the cup. She took it but didn't drink. Her fingers curled around the ceramic, like she needed the warmth more than the tea. Deborah slipped into the hallway with the twins, gave us space without being asked. That kind of grace doesn't come with training. It's lived. They're asking about the kids, Leanne said after a while, about meeting them. They've never called them by name, I replied. I know. We sat on the couch. The cushions had that soft give of overuse. Leanne crossed her legs tightly, as if keeping herself contained. I didn't know it would get this bad, she said. They've always been like this, I told her. You just didn't notice. I really didn't know, she whispered. I believe you. It wasn't an absolution, but it wasn't a wall either. We were quiet after that, the kind of quiet that settles when something has cracked, but not yet collapsed. The front door creaked. Deborah re-entered, one twin on each hip. Her cardigan had a new stain, Noah probably, and her hair had loosened from its braid. But she looked content. She handed me Maisie and passed Noah to Leanne, who hesitated, then accepted him like he was made of something rare. As she bounced him gently on her knee, I watched something shift in her shoulders. They never came for me, but I'm done going to them, Leanne said. They're asking to meet the twins. I answer, let them ask. My parents came 5 days late, with pastries, stiff smiles, and stories about how the concert wasn't even good. They arrived like they were guests at a housewarming, not a reunion after betrayal. My mother wore her hair clipped back, her earrings modest for once, like someone had told her this wasn't the time for sparkle. My father carried a bakery bag like it was an olive branch. We met at the Bluefinch Cafe downtown. I'd picked it because it had a patio, and I could see every approach from all directions. The waitress brought jasmine tea without asking. She remembered my order from before the hospital. I sat at the table alone for a while before they showed. I didn't stand when they arrived, didn't offer hugs. We brought lemon pie, my mother said. I nodded. The jazz trio across the square played something soft and slow. Moon River, I think. I watched Mr. Wendell pass with his basset hound, gave him a small wave. He tipped his cap, didn't stop walking. My father cleared his throat. We've started volunteering at the community garden. I forgot how much I dislike weeding. That must be humbling, I said. He gave a half laugh. My mother fidgeted with the pastry box. We're not here to ask for money, she said. That ship has sailed and sunk. Then why are you here? My father looked at my mother, then back to me. We just thought, maybe someday, you'd let us know your children. The sunlight shifted across the patio bricks. I stirred my tea once, twice. You had that chance, I said. You chose fiddle solos over holding your daughter's hand. My mother's mouth parted, then closed. I had stitches, I continued, pain meds, 2 infants, and not even a voicemail asking if I was breathing. We were wrong, my father said. I raised an eyebrow. Very wrong, he added. And we've been doing a lot of thinking. Thinking doesn't change diapers, I said. My mother's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. Leanne told us how you looked, she said. Thin, pale, tired. She's right, I said. But she still showed up. The tea had cooled. I took a slow sip anyway. Across the square, a child ran ahead of his grandfather, laughing. A breeze lifted the edges of the napkins on the table. My father placed an envelope beside the pastries. No strings. I didn't touch it. I've already paid the price. We know, my mother said, but we'd like to begin again. No, I said. You'd like access. That's not the same. The silence was full, but not hostile, just the weight of what had been lost. I'm their mother, I said, and I won't let anyone close who doesn't respect that. They didn't argue, didn't beg. My father just nodded and reached for his glasses cloth, wiping them like it gave him something to do with his hands. I stood, folded my napkin, placed a tip under the sugar jar like I always did. Goodbye, I said. I didn't hug them, didn't promise to call, but I didn't walk away angry. The bricks of the square felt uneven underfoot, like the path was still settling. I turned the corner, sunlight catching the edge of the bookstore sign I used to visit with Ethan. Near the fountain, Leanne stood holding Lily on her hip, while Noah clutched a paper bag of crackers. Deborah was crouched beside them, pointing at something in the water, koi maybe, or just the way the ripples caught the light. Mr. Wendell stood a few steps behind them, his basset hound snuffling the grass. As I approached, he looked up and gave me that same short nod, the kind that came from someone who knew more than he said. Told you, he said to Leanne, she's stronger than she looks. I never expected that the person who would stay through my hardest night would be someone I didn't even know the week before, but maybe that's what kindness really is. Something quiet, steady, and unexpected. When we stop measuring people by how they look or where they come from, we begin to see the strength in those we once overlooked. Kindness has a way of circling back when we need it most, often through the hands of those we least expect. So if someone shows up for you without needing a reason, hold on. That might just be the kind of love that builds a better ending.